The alarm wasn't the kind that woke people up. It was the kind that stopped them mid-breath. Sarah Hayes was in the 13th hour of what was officially an 8-hour shift, eyes half closed, staring at a screen that displayed the same symphony of cosmic static it had shown for 6 years. The coffee in her mug had been cold long enough to form an oily film on the surface, and she was in the process of ignoring that fact when her front console simply went insane. It wasn't a soft beep. It was a concert of blaring red alerts that turned the signal analysis cabin of Meridian 9 into something resembling the inside of a siren. What was that? The voice came through the intercom before she could even process what she was seeing. It was Miller, the structural maintenance tech, who had probably been sleeping in the break room and had just fallen out of his bunk. Hayes didn't answer. She was reading, and the more she read, the less air she could find in her lungs. A cascade pulse. She knew the concept the same way she knew mathematical formulas from a dead language, theoretically, abstractly, as something that existed in manuals and not in the real world. The cascade pulse was the last resort distress signal of the high races of the Concord, a protocol reserved for civilization-scale catastrophes. In 400 years of human monitoring of the galactic electromagnetic spectrum, it had never been detected by a single terrestrial or colonial station. Meridian 9 had been in operation for 11 years. It was a signal relay platform on the edge of human-mapped space, battered by the solar winds of a dying yellow dwarf star, inhabited by 14 people whose main daily challenge was not going crazy from the silence. The station had no weapons. It had 2 emergency shuttles with a maximum range of a 3-day journey. It had fuel reserves for another 18 months of autonomous operation and a relay antenna that needed recalibration every week because the structure was aging faster than the maintenance budget allowed them to fix. It was, for all practical purposes, irrelevant to the universe. And yet, the universe had just screamed at her. Hayes. The voice was different now, deeper, more awake. What are you seeing? Captain Marcus Hale had this peculiar quality of appearing in places exactly when he was needed, as if some instinct honed by 32 years of space service acted as an independent biological alarm. He was 57, with a face that battle maps would have envied for the amount of history etched into it, and the posture of someone who had given up trying to impress his superiors long enough ago to become genuinely capable of anything. Hayes turned the screen toward him without a word. Hale read in silence. She counted the seconds by the rhythm of his breathing, which started regular and grew slower, more controlled, the way it happens when the mind demands more resources and the body obeys. "Decode the payload," he said finally. "It's already decoded, Captain. This is what we have." The cascade pulse wasn't just a distress signal. It was a compressed data packet containing coordinates, the nature of the incident, casualty estimates, and the viability window for a rescue. It was essentially a galactic medical chart broadcast at the speed of despair. The coordinates pointed to the Void Scar. Hale knew the Void Scar the same way any experienced navigator knew the places where ships vanished without a trace. It was a region the size of a solar system where ancient wars between the high races had twisted physics in ways humanity had yet to fully catalog. Gravitational fields behaved erratically. Slipspace was unstable. Navigational charts had only one note: not recommended for any class of vessel. The nature of the incident: critical failure of a living structure. Hayes had read about living structures in an academic paper that had circulated through colonial science departments 3 years prior. The species known in human archives as the Lumerons, due to their characteristic bioluminescence, had built their civilization entirely around organic space stations, biological colossi that grew over generations like planetary-scale coral reefs. They weren't just stations. They were homes, ecosystems, cultural memories, and life support infrastructure, all fused into a single interdependent organism. When a living structure died, everything inside it died too. Estimated casualties: 6,342,000,000 individuals. Viability window: 42 standard galactic days. Hale stared at the number long enough for Hayes to feel the silence in the cabin as something physical, like pressure. "Relay it to the Concorde," he said. "Already sent, Captain. Emergency protocol. Maximum priority. Receipt confirmed 11 minutes ago." And Hayes opened a second window on her screen. It was the Concorde's response, formatted with the bureaucratic precision the high races had perfected over millennia. Short, technical, polite in the way only absolute indifference can be. "Rescue operation classified as unviable," Hale read aloud, and there was something in the quality of his voice that Hayes couldn't name, something that was too angry to just be anger. "Logistical risks associated with the void scar exceed acceptable loss parameters. We recommend Meridian 9 archive the signal and resume standard operations. The Concorde mourns the inevitable loss." The silence that followed had texture. 6 billion, Hayes said, not because Hale needed to hear the number again, but because she needed to say it out loud to understand it was real. 6 billion, he confirmed. She watched him. 32 years of service, she knew, had taken Hale down a path that seemed designed to keep him away from anywhere he could make a difference. A career that had started with brilliance and was gradually relegated to remote outposts, to stations without prestige, to assignments that Academy graduates looked at with veiled pity. There were reasons for this. Hale had a dangerous tendency to believe that rules existed for situations the rule-makers had managed to imagine, and that situations no bureaucrat had foreseen required different tools. High Command called this tendency instability of judgment. The 14 crew members of Meridian 9 had another name for it. "Wake everyone up," Hale said. "Meeting in 20 minutes in the briefing room." Hayes was already on her feet before he finished the sentence. The briefing was the kind of meeting that has no agenda because the situation is too massive to fit into organized bullet points. 14 people around an oval table with a crack in the right corner that had been repaired 3 times and split open again. Engineers, technicians, medics, communicators, the backup pilot. People who had ended up on Meridian 9 for various reasons and discovered that isolation created a type of intimacy unlike any other. They knew how everyone took their coffee, what each person mumbled during nightmares, which stories everyone had told and retold until they became shared personal mythology. Hale didn't sugarcoat it. He showed the signal, showed the Concorde's response, presented the numbers. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the comms cabin. It was an inhabited silence, where 14 different minds reached the same impossible arithmetic through different paths. "We don't have a fleet," said Chief Engineer Jackson. It wasn't an objection, it was an inventory. "No," Hale agreed. "We don't have the tech to cross the scar," said Dr. Evans, the station's chief medical officer. "Not conventionally." "The Concorde will block any attempt," said the navigator Bennett. "Probably." Hayes was watching their faces. Something was happening in this room that she had only seen once before, when a supply shuttle had failed mid-vacuum 12 hours from the station, and the 12 crew members had looked at each other and decided, without a formal vote, that they were going out to get it with the gear they had and the fuel they could spare. No one had asked permission. No one had waited for orders. "What are you thinking, Captain?" asked communications tech Chloe Smith. Hale crossed his arms over the table. "I'm thinking the Concorde is right about the risks. I'm thinking 6 billion people are dying right now while we're sitting here talking, and I'm thinking we are the only station in range that received that signal and hasn't archived it yet." A pause. "I'm thinking we have a long-range transmitter with access to the Galactic Press Network, and I'm thinking the universe has a curious tendency to behave differently when it's being watched." Hayes felt something settle in her spine, a certainty of perfect geometry, like when an equation resists for hours and suddenly reveals its solution with the inevitability of something that was always there. She opened her laptop. "When do you want to broadcast?" Hale looked at her with that expression she had learned to recognize as his version of gratitude, compressed to fit within the confines of a face that had given up on being easily read. "Now," he said, "before I change my mind." No one laughed, but something shifted in the air of the room. 14 people who had woken up that day for another shift of monotony on the forgotten edge of the galaxy were discovering that the universe had decided, without consulting them, that this was the day Meridian 9 would stop being irrelevant. Hayes started typing, and the signal that had screamed at her began, at that moment, to scream at everyone else. The broadcast hit the Galactic Press Networks at 0347 hours, Station Standard Time, when the majority of cataloged civilizations were in some variant of a rest cycle and content curation algorithms were operating with lower editorial oversight. Hayes had calculated the timing deliberately. The packet she sent wasn't just the Lumaran distress signal. It was a document composed of 3 layers: the original message in raw format, the full decode with casualty estimates, and the Concord's official response, formatted with the exact same bureaucratic precision with which it had been received. No editorial commentary, no emotional manipulation, just the facts laid side by side with the brutal clarity of an equation solving itself. 6 billion lives, unviable. Hale had stood behind her while she prepared the file, and she felt the weight of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had made peace with the consequences. When she hit the transmit button, he didn't say anything. He just nodded once, as if confirming to himself a decision made long before tonight. The institutional blowback arrived in 14 hours. Regional Commander Richard Sterling's message was formally precise in its rage, the kind of communication drafted by lawyers before being sent. Phrases like gross insubordination, violation of operational silence protocol, and immediate disciplinary proceedings appeared with the frequency of a penal manual. Hale read it aloud to the assembled crew, devoid of inflection, like he was reading a diner menu. "Acknowledged," he replied to the dispatch. "We await formal proceedings." But the institutional blowback was the least of that day's developments. The first sign that something different was happening came at 1923 hours, when the station's long-range antenna began logging a volume of response transmissions that temporarily overloaded their processing filters. Hayes had to manually reconfigure the parameters 3 times before she could even begin categorizing what was coming in. They were humans. Not the kind of humans who used official channels. These were civilian feeds, commercial frequencies, peripheral colony comm networks, broadcasts from mining stations and frontier outposts, and research platforms that normally only traded nav data and supply requests. They were the voices of people who had seen the broadcast and wanted to do something, anything, without quite knowing what. "This is an emotional response," Jackson said, looking at the numbers with the slightly baffled pragmatism of an engineer confronted with data that resisted technical categorization. "It's logistically useless." "Depends," Hayes said. She was tracking a pattern in the data, emerging with the clarity of a coherent signal cutting through static. The messages weren't just expressions of shock. Many contained specific offers. A freighter captain estimating he had enough fuel for a one-way trip plus 20%. A repair shop on a mining colony with experimental shielding tested for high radiation environments. A retired naval engineer who had worked decades ago on a disturbed space navigation project and thought her calculations might apply to the void scar, if anyone cared to listen. Individually, every offer was insufficient. Together, they started to look like the blueprint for something impossible. "Captain," Hayes called out. Hale was on the phone, or the modern equivalent of it, with regional command. When he cut the connection and walked over to her, there was a difference in the quality of his silence. Not the heavy weight from before, but something closer to razor-sharp focus. She showed him the data. He stood beside her for a long moment, reading. She watched him process it, saw the exact moment the arithmetic of the situation rearranged itself in his head. "How long to catalog what we have?" he asked. "With the whole crew pitching in, 48 hours for a preliminary inventory. 72 for something that tells us if it's technically feasible. Do it in 36. The work that followed was the kind that happens when 14 people decide that sleep is a negotiation. Meridian 9's ops room transformed into a makeshift coordination center, screens split between logistical capacity analysis, potential route mapping, and continuous communication with the dozens of sources still replying to the signal. Admiral James Hastings made contact at hour 23 of day 2. Hayes had heard the name before, the way one hears about natural disasters and historical figures. Hastings had commanded the defense fleet at the Proxima colony during the Calvera incident. When a cascading life support failure threatened 40,000 colonists, he orchestrated an evacuation using ships that official engineers had declared unfit for flight. The subsequent report described his decisions as tactically unacceptable and operationally successful. High Command filed the report in a category reserved specifically for things that worked in ways the manuals couldn't predict. Hastings was 61, armed with a network built over 4 decades of service in posts, the conventional career track, deemed secondary. When he heard Hale's broadcast, he spent 36 hours making calls. "I have 31 vessels," he said bluntly, without preamble. His voice had the texture of someone who saved his words for when they mattered. "They aren't the fleet's finest. Most have seen 15 to 20 years of service, but they're operational, and I have volunteer crews for every single one of them." "Volunteers who know where they're going?" Hale asked. "Volunteers who know exactly where they are going," Hastings confirmed. "Nobody boards this op by mistake, Captain. That is non-negotiable." And the issues with High Command. There was a pause that sounded like a man choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood the distinction between what is said and what is recorded. "High Command will issue a formal stand-down order the second they realize we're serious. I figure we have between 48 and 72 hours before that happens. A beat. Long enough to be en route before any order can effectively be delivered." Hayes watched Hale during this exchange. There was a dynamic between the two men she recognized, the mutual acknowledgement of people who had arrived at the same place via different roads. The shared understanding that there were moments when the weight of possibility was heavier than the weight of the rules insisting that possibility didn't exist. "I need something from you," Hale said. "I have a signals analyst who's spent 3 days drafting a nav protocol for the Void Scar. She's going to need a platform to test it." Hastings didn't hesitate. "She's got one. The command ship is hers to work with." When the feed cut, Hayes stared at her screen for a moment. The protocol Hale mentioned was a string of equations she had started scribbling the hour she received the signal. Over the last 72 hours, it had evolved into something she couldn't accurately name because conventional names didn't apply. The Void Scar warped space in ways instruments registered as noise because instruments were designed to measure patterns, and the Void lacked conventional patterns. But Hayes had spent 6 years monitoring the cosmic static of the frontier, and she had learned something no manual taught. What looked like noise to a machine was often just a signal waiting for the right receiver. The protocol she developed didn't try to eliminate the Void's distortions, it tried to surf them. It treated the anomalies not as obstacles, but as data points, making continuous adjustments based on real-time readings. It was mathematically complex in a way that terrified the engineers when she showed them the math. But it had one component she couldn't formalize in technical jargon. It was the component the retired naval engineer had called pilot's instinct. It was the thing the aliens, with all their ancient godlike technology, likely no longer possessed. Because pilot's instinct was born from millennia of navigating hostile space with inadequate instruments, From generations of pilots learning to trust information computers couldn't process because it was too fast to catch or too subtle to categorize. It was the accumulated wisdom of a species that survived the cosmos not because they mastered physics, but because they learned to work within the spaces between what could be measured. Hale stepped up and stood beside her, looking at the same screen. "You know it's going to be rough," he said. "I know. And you want to go anyway." It wasn't a question. 6 billion, Hayes said. It was the only answer she had. Hale nodded once. "Then we're going to need more coffee than we currently have in stock." He paused. "And you are going to sleep for at least 4 hours before we board. Non-negotiable." Hayes almost smiled. Almost. Departure was set for 36 hours. Somewhere beyond the reach of human instruments, 6 billion bioluminescent lights were going out, one by one, with the indifferent patience of a universe that couldn't distinguish between tragedy and mechanics. Humanity was going to turn them back on. The human response fleet departed with 31 vessels and 907 more volunteers than planned. Hastings had budgeted for 9,000 crew members. They ended up with 9,943. The extras were people who simply showed up at the docking bays of 5 different colonies carrying duffel bags, relevant skills, and the resolute expressions of people who had made a decision requiring 0 external approval. A group of 17 biosystems engineers arrived from the Kepler 442 colony with organic interface gear no one had requisitioned. Upon reviewing the Lumaran's technical specs, Hastings classified it as potentially essential. A medical team specializing in systemic trauma boarded the frigate Endurance with far more supplies than the ship technically had room for, solving the issue with a creative packing strategy that defied conventional laws of geometry. No one was turned away. Hayes stood on the bridge of the command ship, the science corvette Aegis, for the first 12 hours of the flight. She watched the fleet organize around her with the chaotic, functionally efficient dynamic of an organism that had never existed before, inventing its own patterns in real time. Ships of different classes, sporting mildly incompatible comm systems, and maneuvering protocols from wildly different schools of flight found a shared rhythm through continuous negotiation. Outside observers would have called it a mess. From the inside, it felt extraordinarily organic. Hastings had designated discrete comm channels for every aspect of the op, plus a central channel he called the Town Square, where any crewman on any ship could broadcast to the entire fleet. Most military historians Hayes had studied would have viewed that level of transparency as an invitation to mutiny. Hastings viewed it as load-bearing architecture. "When people know what's happening," he had explained to Hale during the departure brief, "they ask better questions and make better decisions. And in the moments where I need them to do exactly what I say without asking why, they'll trust me because they know I don't hide the ball." High Command's official stand-down order arrived 18 hours after departure, right as the fleet slipped beyond the effective range of physical intervention. Hale read it aloud to the crew of the Aegis with the same flat intonation he used for the first warning. Somebody down in engine control broadcasted an unofficial reply on the town square that violated at least 3 communications regulations and was biologically explicit about where High Command could shove their order. Captain Hale spent 3 seconds considering a formal reprimand before deciding his day held more pressing issues. Entry into the peripheral zone of the Void Scar occurred on the 15th day. Hayes had described the scar to Hastings in highly technical terms during prep, but there was something clinical language couldn't capture, something she hadn't fully grasped until she saw it through the Aegis's optical sensors. The scar didn't look dangerous. It looked like art. It was a region where space had been folded and refolded by energies on a scale humanity hadn't properly classified. The result was a visual field instruments registered as interference, but which the human eye strangely interpreted as a tapestry. Nebulas of impossible geometry, gravitational fields acting as natural magnifying lenses, displaying stars that should have been invisible from this quadrant. colors across the electromagnetic spectrum that lacked names because no astronomer had ever needed to name them. "It's beautiful," said the Aegis pilot, Lieutenant Jessica Brooks, sounding slightly bewildered, the tone of someone bracing for terror and getting wonder instead. "Yeah," Hayes agreed. "Don't let it distract you." The navigation protocol Hayes had engineered relied on a triple feed system. The ship's standard instruments, the experimental sensor suite mailed in by the retired engineer that Hayes had jury-rigged during transit, and the raw judgment of the human pilots interpreting the data on the fly. Concorde engineers would have dismissed the system as fatally reliant on subjective variables. That was exactly why it worked where their calculators failed. The first test arrived 16 hours into the SCAR. Forward probes bounced back telemetry on a structure the sensors initially flagged as a rock formation. But as the data aggregated, it looked less like rock and more like something that had a very long time ago been forged. "Those are war machines," said Subcommander Ryan Fletcher, the Aegis's tactical officer. He spoke with the quiet tension of a man trained for combat who sincerely preferred to avoid it. Autonomous, vintage by galactic standards, but still hot. Hayes studied the feed. The machines bore a design she recognized from archaeological databases, dark builders, as the ancient races called them. Automated defense platforms birthed in a war that ended before humanity invented the written word, left to endlessly patrol because the deactivation codes had died with the empire that wrote them. Concorde manuals classified them as a minor logistical nuisance that any competent fleet could bypass with standard maneuvers. What standard maneuvers failed to account for was the SCAR. Inside the distortion zone, conventional evasion math relied on conventional physics. The machines, having spent millennia marinating in the anomaly, had adapted their pursuit algorithms to the local reality. They weren't faster than human ships, but they knew the terrain in a way no outsider could replicate with mere instruments. "We need a different angle," Hayes told Hastings over the comm. "Listening. The machines follow logical patterns, pursuit by trajectory optimization. They calculate the most mathematically efficient path from point A to point B and execute it. And humans don't do that, especially when we're scared and flying on gut instinct. We do things an optimization algorithm flags as errors, because those errors create vectors the algorithm literally cannot predict." Hastings was quiet for 3 seconds. "You're saying our handicap is our weapon. I'm saying our unpredictability isn't a bug. It's a feature." The engagement that followed lasted 4 hours and 42 minutes. Future after-action reports would label it tactically irregular but operationally efficient. Administrative shorthand for nobody can fully explain how it worked, but it did. Human pilots flew in ways that would have gotten them grounded by their academy instructors. They executed maneuvers that dragged friendly fire lanes across intersecting angles simulators marked as fatal. They ripped their ships into vectors heading dead-on toward the machines, only to violently shear off into gravity wells no algorithm recognized as navigable. The machines were faster in a straight line. The humans were wildly unpredictable in a curve. The fleet lost 3 ships. The official records wouldn't list the names, but Hayes knew every one of them. 27 crew members. The ships had ordered evacuations before critical system failure, and the recovery frigates scooped up most of the pods. But not all of them. Never all of them. When the last machine was reduced to slag and the fleet resumed its heading toward the Lumaran living structure, Hayes stood on the bridge of the Aegis and stared into the void with the distinct feeling that space had struck a bargain with them, reluctant but fair. On the town square channel, Hastings's voice echoed with the grit of a man who had counted the costs and found they still had enough capital to keep going. "Good work, everyone," he said. "Simple enough." And there, on the nav screens, projected against the impossible backdrop of the void scar, the shape of the Lumaran's living structure finally emerged, a coherent signal rising out of the noise. It was massive, and it was dying. The living structure was named Alindra. Hayes learned this from the first Lumaran who managed to establish coherent communication, a being roughly 6 feet tall who drifted into the docking umbilical with the effortless grace of someone born to low gravity. Its bioluminescent blue skin pulsed in complex, shifting patterns that the universal translator took 47 seconds to crack. The light pattern was the language. It wasn't an accompaniment to sound. It was the primary tongue. The audible voice was just the machine's translation. The Lumaran identified itself as Velith Aus. Based on the frequency decay of its bioluminescence, the translator flagged the being as suffering from severe exhaustion. "You are human," said the synthesized translation of Velith Aus's glow. There was an inflection in the artificial voice that Hayes interpreted, perhaps incorrectly, as hovering somewhere between disbelief and relief. "We are," Hale confirmed. "The Concord said it would be unviable." "The Concord has a definition of unviable that doesn't include humans," Hale replied. "We find that to be a definitional flaw." Velith Eos's light pulsed in a rhythm the translator categorized as a laugh, but which the science team would later footnote as closer in meaning to the recognition of an unexpected truth. Alindra was 2,300 years old. It was a biological entity the size of a small moon, cultivated over generations by a civilization that decided deep in its ancient history not to forge worlds of metal and silicon, but to grow worlds of carbon and consciousness. Its outer hull was a vast expanse of biological tissue that reacted to stimuli with the sluggish grace of something very large and very old. Its interior was a labyrinth of chambers and conduits acting simultaneously as arteries, nervous systems, and living rooms. 6 billion Lumarans lived, worked, and bred inside it with the natural fluidity of cells within a host. Except the host was failing. The human engineering team spent 6 hours on the initial inspection. Hayes read the rolling telemetry with the mounting dread of reading a terminal medical chart scaled up to a size language wasn't designed to hold. Alindra's power systems, rooted in a biochemical conversion technology humanity hadn't even theorized, had been cascading toward failure for 72 standard days. The early symptoms had been misdiagnosed as the natural degradation of an ancient organism. By the time the true scope of the crisis was obvious, the window for a conventional fix had slammed shut. Chief Engineer Jackson emerged from the inspection looking like a man whose entire definition of the word engineering had just been rewritten. "It's like someone ripped the heart out of the system," Jackson told Hale. "Not a metaphor. There's a central energy conversion node that basically does what a heart does, pumps power out to the peripheral systems, and somebody sabotaged it. Highly specific. It was designed to look exactly like natural cellular decay if you didn't know exactly what to look for." "But we do know what to look for," Hale said. "We do because Dr. Evans spotted irregularities in the failure cascades that didn't match any biological degradation model she's ever studied. It's the kind of catch you only make if you have a medical background and treat the whole station like a trauma patient instead of a busted engine." That, Hayes realized, was precisely the perspective Concord engineers lacked. To them, Alindra was infrastructure. To Evans, it was a body. The revelation of sabotage hit as a technical data point before it landed as a moral atrocity. Jackson traced the failure to a specific component within the conversion node. 96 days ago, during routine maintenance, it had been swapped out for a version that was structurally identical but chemically malignant. The rogue component was slowly dissolving the adjacent tissues through a process basic scanners couldn't distinguish from old age. The chemical signature on the component was manufactured by the Concord. Hale let the silence hang for a long time when Jackson presented the findings. "How much time do we have?" he asked finally. "For Alindra? At current decay rates, the central node goes into total arrest in 19 standard days. Once that drops, the peripheral life support cascades into darkness. Total loss in 48 to 72 hours after that. And for a fix? Jackson glanced at Hayes before answering. That depends on her, he said. What Hayes had been designing since she first set foot on Alindra was a protocol that didn't exist in any textbook because nobody had ever needed to write it. A handshake interface between rugged human tech and civilization-scale alien biology. The nuclear reactors driving human ships operated on physics utterly alien to the biochemical energy conversion of the Lumarans. Splicing the two systems together was the equivalent of trying to use a car battery to jumpstart a human being. Not metaphorically, literally wiring a fission reactor into the chest cavity of a 2,000-year-old organism and forcing it to keep beating. But there was a sliver of daylight. The biosystems engineers who had boarded at the last second with their unrequested gear had identified structures within Alindra that functioned as natural energy sinks. They were damaged by the sabotage, but not dead. If they could be artificially stabilized while the poison component was surgically excised and replaced, the math showed a theoretical path to success. The briefing room went dead silent when Hayes displayed the calculated probability, 43%. That's less than a coin flip, said Bennett, the navigator. He was in the briefing because he represented the perspective of the people who would die if the mission failed, which Hastings argued was the most vital perspective in any room. Yeah, Hayes said. And the alternative? 0%. The Concorde calculated this as unviable because they ran the numbers using standard tech. Given the time frame, their success rate was effectively 0. Then 43% is infinitely better than 0. Hastings said. His voice carried the weight of a commander who had bet it all on worse odds. Mathematically, yes. So when do we start cutting? The operation took 72 hours. In the historical archives that came later, it would be immortalized as the first documented planetary-scale interspecies surgery. On the ground, it looked like highly coordinated, desperate chaos. Human engineering teams worked grueling 6-hour shifts inside Alindra's arterial chambers, environments pressurized and heated for a completely different species. They wore bio-interface suits that allowed them to talk to the surrounding organic tech in ways the engineers barely understood. But the biologists understood better than they could explain. Lumarans worked shoulder to shoulder with them. Their bioluminescent bodies acted as both floodlights and real-time translators, guiding the human teams through living schematics no human map had ever charted. There were moments of sheer absurdity that would never make the official reports. An engineer named Cooper spending 6 hours calibrating the patch on a portable antimatter reactor to alien tissue while slamming his third packet of concentrated caffeine. The Lumarans watched him with visible glowing distress. The compound was moderately toxic to every silicon-based life form in the galaxy, and they simply could not process why a biological entity would voluntarily ingest it. There were moments of profound beauty that defied categorization. The exact second the first human reactor locked into Alindra's conversion tissue and successfully fired. The entire structure rippled with a wave of light that the Lumarans later translated as the cultural equivalent of a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. And there were stretches of time where that 43% probability felt agonizingly optimistic. Then, 71 hours and 47 minutes into the operation, Alindra's central node registered stabilization. Jackson calmed Hayes. He sounded like a man who had slept 4 hours in 3 days and found he didn't care in the slightest. "It's holding," he rasped. Hayes was on the Aegis bridge when the feed came through. She stared at her monitor for 3 seconds, then looked out the primary viewport, where the sprawling expanse of Alindra's hull stretched out as far as the sensors could see. On the town square channel, the news swept the fleet in 90 seconds, the sound that erupted from 9,943 throats across 28 ships, was the kind of noise the vacuum of space physically prevents from traveling. But Hayes heard it anyway. In her own throat, in her lungs, in some place buried far beneath language. The euphoria lasted exactly 36 minutes. Then the long-range sensors picked up company. The Concorde fleet was comprised of 18 warships, and they weren't coming to help. The 18 conquered dreadnoughts didn't immediately open fire. Hayes had spent 6 years analyzing high-race signal traffic. She knew this wasn't hesitation. It was procedure. Civilizations that commanded empires over millennia developed protocols for everything, including the elimination of inconvenient witnesses. The protocols existed because ancient empires understood that rushed violence created messes, while calculated violence erased them entirely. The Concorde Fleet Admiral, flagged by sensors as bearing the crest of House Theracar-Vel, opened a formal channel. Unauthorized human vessels. The translator's voice was flawlessly neutral. But the phrasing carried a cadence that Hastings, a man with 40 years of reading diplomatic crosshairs, classified as the courtesy right before the trigger pull. You are operating inside a conquered exclusion zone without authorization. Stand down your operation immediately and prepare to be escorted for formal processing. Hastings looked at Hale. Hale looked at Hayes. Formal processing was a euphemism all three understood with the cold clarity of people who had read the redacted files on how the Concorde handled irregularities. There would be no trial. There would be the galactic equivalent of a black site and a file permanently locked in a basement. "We need time," Hayes murmured. "How much?" Hastings asked. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Hastings opened the return channel. When he spoke, he sounded like a man haggling over produce, a commander who knew that talking was always cheaper than bleeding. "Admiral, appreciate the hail. We are currently mid-cycle on a live humanitarian intervention. We require a window to secure the safety of our engineering teams before we can transition our operational status. Requesting a 30-minute coordination hold for safe disengagement protocols." 6 seconds of dead air followed. In galactic diplomatic timing, that was a heavy, pregnant pause. "You have 15 minutes, the Concorde Admiral replied. "Upon expiration, we will take the necessary measures to restore order." Hastings killed the feed and turned to Hayes. 14 minutes and 50 seconds. What Hayes had been compiling since minute 36 of Elindra's stabilization wasn't a tactical firing solution. The human fleet had 28 battered ships against 18 pieces of Apex technology. The brutal math of a shooting war ended poorly for humanity on every conceivable vector. But during their 72 hours inside Elindra's guts, the science teams had collected a different kind of ammunition. Jackson had documented the sabotage with the obsessive paranoia of an engineer who knew that vague data was worse than no data. Every poisoned component sliced out of the node had been imaged, cataloged, and run through chemical spectroscopy. The Concorde manufacturing signature wasn't a theory. It was an ironclad, indisputable fact, backed by a chain of evidence that could withstand the most brutal forensic audit. Velith Ios had supplied the rest, moving with the frantic urgency of a being who had waited far too long to scream. He provided Elindra's maintenance logs for the last 180 days, including the digital access stamps identifying exactly which maintenance crew had swapped the parts. Concorde identifiers. Traceable. Damning. It wasn't a case that required lawyers to argue. It was a case that required a transmitter. "What you're about to do," Hale said, watching Hayes configure the payload, his voice dropping into the solemn register of a man confirming consent before striking a match, "is going to trigger fallout that goes way beyond this op." "I know," Hayes said. "The Conquered won't forget this." "No. But 6 billion Lumerans won't forget it either. And the rest of the galaxy won't forget it. That's the part that matters." Hale let the silence hang for a heartbeat. "You have 12 minutes. The broadcast Hayes prepped was entirely different from her first one. The first had been a press release designed to ignite a fire. This was a raw data dump, hardwired simultaneously into every public conduit in the sector: news networks, diplomatic back channels, scientific frequencies, and the open-source Concord public archives that any citizen of the galaxy could legally tap. No voiceover, no editorializing, just the raw feed, the chemical breakdown of the sabotage, the maintenance access logs, the timeline of the decay, the Concord's official unviable response to the distress call, and a live-streamed telemetry feed showing 18 Concorde warships currently holding position 25,000 miles off the bow of a station housing 6 billion civilians. Civilians currently being kept alive by a primitive human engineering crew working 6-hour shifts. Hayes slammed the transmit button with 1 minute and 43 seconds to spare. The resulting silence lasted 48 seconds. Then the Concorde comm channel flared back to life. The audio quality of Admiral Thericar Vell's voice had shifted. The courtesy was still there. The protocol was still intact. But the absolute, bedrock certainty that had anchored the first transmission had completely evaporated. "Human vessels," the Admiral said. "We are instituting a temporary hold on operational status while we review recently received data packets." Hastings keyed the mic. "Of course, Admiral. Always happy to cooperate with formal reviews." He let a razor-thin pause drop. On an open channel, naturally, given that all interested parties are now fully briefed on the situation. Over 100 distinct civilizations tapped into the galactic comm network had received Hayes's data dump in the last 48 seconds. Many of them were junior members of the Concorde. Many harbored deep, generational grudges about how the high races managed lesser species. Right at that very second, all of them were looking at live footage of an armada squaring off against a hospital, staring at undeniable proof that the patient had been deliberately poisoned. The universe, Hayes had learned over 6 long years of listening, had a very specific way of behaving when the lights were turned on. The 18 Concorde dreadnoughts held their position at 25,000 miles. They did not advance an inch. "Concorde fleet is holding steady," Fletcher reported from Tactical, sounding like a man slowly unclamping his jaw. "For how long?" Hastings asked. "Hard to model. Depends entirely on how much of that data hit receivers with enough political capital to make the Concorde sweat." "And how much did?" Hayes had been watching the digital delivery receipts flood in since the moment she hit send. She looked at the cascading numbers on her screen and felt something that wasn't exactly shock, but rather the quiet validation of a theory she had built without daring to fully believe in it. "Diplomatic channels from 47 distinct civilizations just confirmed receipt," she said quietly, "including 7 seats on the Concorde Inner Council." A new kind of silence fell over the bridge of the Aegis. It was the silence of people realizing that a massive, ancient tectonic plate had just violently shifted, and that they, impossibly, were the crowbar that moved it. Valith Ios had drifted onto the bridge at some point during the standoff. Nobody had noticed his arrival, but he was there, his bioluminescence throbbing in a rapid, complex pattern the translator was struggling to keep up with. When Hayes met his eyes, his skin flashed a brief sequence. "You weaponized information," the synthesized voice said. There was a profound, almost reverent awe in the mechanical inflection. "We did not calculate that as a viable vector." "It's the oldest weapon we have," Hale said. "Older than the ships, older than the tech." Valith Aos pulsed again, a long, flowing cascade of blue light. The translator chewed on it for nearly a minute before speaking. "In our root language," the machine translated, hesitating slightly as it mapped alien philosophy onto human syntax, "there is a specific term for the act of casting light into darkness. Not to illuminate your own path, but deliberately, so that others are forced to see. There is no clean equivalent in standard galactic trade tongue. The closest translation is, to bear witness with intent." Velith Eos looked at Hale, then at Hayes. "You have borne witness. On the long-range scanners, the 18 Concorde dreadnoughts sat motionless. But across the galactic communication web, something unstoppable was moving. The truth was burning through the frequencies, lighting up every receiver that mattered. Elindra was breathing, and the universe was watching." The Concorde fleet's retreat wasn't hasty. It was the calculated drift of a predator preserving the illusion of choice. Slow enough to avoid looking like a rout, but steady enough that, 22 hours after Hayes' broadcast, the warships had slipped beyond the tactical perimeter of Elindra. No official statement was issued. That was the playbook for disasters. A statement created a permanent record. Over millennia of galactic politics, the Concorde had learned that a deafening silence was often the most defensible fortress. But the Concorde's silence was instantly drowned out by the noise erupting from the rest of the galaxy. Hayes monitored the comm networks for the next 48 hours with the same intense focus she'd given the Lumaran's initial distress ping. Except now, the network wasn't screaming for help. It was screaming for blood. 7 formal inquiries had been triggered by the Concorde Inner Council. 2 high races, possessing manufacturing tech capable of producing the sabotaged components, issued preemptive broadcasts officially distancing themselves from the incident. Dozens of non-Concorde civilizations operating on the periphery released highly sanitized diplomatic memos that, stripped of the jargon, essentially translated to, "We are actively reconsidering our trade alliances." "You didn't just save Elindra," Hastings told Hale during a briefing at the 30-hour mark post-stabilization. "You just redrew the political map of the galaxy." "I didn't do anything of the sort," Hale replied flatly. Hayes broadcasted the math. The galaxy solved the equation. Hastings chewed on that for a moment, evaluating whether Hale was being modest or dangerously literal. He decided on the latter. "There's going to be crosshairs on our backs now," Hastings warned. "On humanity. You kick a pillar that's held the roof up for 10,000 years, the whole house shifts. Some folks will run to our side of the room. Others are going to drop the ceiling on us." "I know," Hale said. "And you'd pull the trigger again tomorrow." It wasn't a question, but Hale answered anyway. "Yes." The Lumaran's gratitude ceremony took place on the 12th day of the stabilization watch. It defied every human expectation of formality. There were no speeches, at least not initially. There was only light. All of Elindra pulsed. It wasn't a localized flicker. The entire 2,300-year-old biological superstructure breathed in unison, a synchronized bioluminescent wave, like a man taking a massive shuddering breath after nearly drowning. The exterior hull flared with kaleidoscopic frequencies that human optical sensors flagged as physically impossible to artificially replicate. It was a display of light that took Lumaran's generations to master, reserved exclusively for the most seismic shifts in the structure's consciousness. Planetary births, mass extinctions, and moments so profound the collective memory demanded they be permanently burned into the biology of the station. The human biologists simply stood at their consoles, speechless. The grease-stained engineers who had spent 3 days buried in Elindra's guts, learning her veins with the intimacy of mechanics rebuilding an engine block, stared out the viewports and forgot how to talk. Velith Eos arrived at the docking umbilical leading a delegation. Based on the shifting hues of their glow, Hayes recognized them as proxies for Elindra's various internal ecosystems. He carried an object that initially looked like a jagged shard of frosted glass. As he drew closer, it became obvious the faint light wasn't catching the crystal. It was bleeding out of it. The stone was biologically alive. "It is our way," Velith Eos's translator chimed softly. "When an entity alters the boundaries of what is possible for our civilization, we anchor the memory of that act into a witness crystal. They are seeded into Elindra's hull. They feed on her biochemistry. They endure, as long as she endures." He offered the crystal to Hale. "For every one of your people who did not make the return journey, Velith said, "A witness crystal will be grown with their designation. They are woven into the structure they bled for. They will exist as long as Elindra exists. Their names will pulse at our exact frequency." Hayes ran the numbers in her head. 203. The final tally had come in hours after the op. The 3 lost ships in the Scar, the fatal accidents during the chaotic transit. 203 volunteers who had packed their bags knowing they were flying into the galactic graveyard, and who had refused to turn back. Hale took the crystal with both hands. It was the universal human gesture for receiving a burden, which it turned out perfectly mirrored the Lumeran gesture for carrying a weight greater than oneself. "Thank you," he said. It was entirely inadequate and entirely enough. Velith flared a long, incredibly dense light pattern. The translator hummed for a full 30 seconds, letting the silence stretch tightly across the airlock. "We searched our deepest ancestral archives," the translation finally echoed. "We queried if there was any precedent for a species willingly diving into the Scar to aid a dying stranger. There is zero precedent. We queried if any species had ever openly dared the wrath of the Concord solely to shield the vulnerable. There is zero precedent." A pulse of brilliant white light. "We asked our memories why humans were the anomaly. The memories did not know. We would be honored to learn." On the long haul back, Hayes sat in the comm suite of the Aegis. It wasn't her usual chair on Meridian 9, but it had become hers over the last 16 days. She held a mug of coffee that, for the first time in the entire mission, was actually hot, because Miller had finally fixed the sector heating coil after years of empty promises. She stared at the telemetry of the void scar rolling across her screens. The graveyard they had sailed through twice, where they had bled, and where they had pulled a miracle out of the static. The after-action report she was currently drafting for High Command required immense political delicacy. It needed the raw engineering data and the void nav protocols that would change deep space flight forever. It required a surgically precise breakdown of the Concorde sabotage, phrased exactly aggressively enough to serve as a legal shield, but cautiously enough to avoid handing command an excuse to declare war. There was a razor-thin line between drafting a historical record and drafting a suicide note. But there was one specific section she didn't know how to translate into military bureau speak. She opened a blank text file. She stared at the blinking cursor, then began typing. Not for High Command, but for herself. The kind of late-night journaling you do when you need to decode your own brain before you can explain it to anyone else. She typed, "Why did we go?" She stared at the words. The logistical answer was easy. Because the distress ping hit her console. Because Hastings had the ships. Because 43% was mathematically vastly superior to 0. Because a burned-out 57-year-old captain made a hard call, and 14 nobodies on a rusted-out relay station backed him up without taking a vote. But that wasn't the truth. There was something hovering in the air during that first briefing around the cracked oval table. That split second, where 14 people looked at a completely impossible piece of arithmetic and collectively agreed that the math was entirely irrelevant. That 6 billion wasn't just a data point. It was a staggering, incomprehensible sum of individual heartbeats, loves, terrors, and memories. The kind of metric that refuses to fit into a risk assessment algorithm, but implicitly drives every choice that actually matters. The high races of the Concorde ran the numbers on a rescue op, weighed the profit against the risk, and found the ROI lacking. Humanity ran the numbers on walking away and found the cost infinitely too high to pay. Hayes typed, "Because we don't know how to do the math any other way." She read the sentence back. Then she kept typing. Maybe that's the trick. Maybe the anomaly isn't that we feel deeper, or fight harder, or fly better. Maybe the difference is that our equation for the value of a life includes a variable the ancient empires erased millennia ago. Maybe it's simply the memory of being vulnerable. the memory of screaming into the dark and needing someone to answer. We know, in our marrow, faster than our brains can process it, that the only reason humanity is still alive today is because, somewhere along the line, someone else refused to do the cold math and reached out their hand instead. She saved the file and killed the screen. Meridian 9 flickered onto the long-range scanners at 14:23 hours on the 19th day of the return transit. It looked impossibly small, a battered, rusting tin can clinging to the edge of the map. With its failing antenna, its 18 months of fuel, and the 14 crew members who had woken up on a Tuesday expecting absolute boredom, only to find the universe violently demanding their attention. Hale was standing on the bridge when the station rendered on the viewport. Hayes stepped up beside him. "High Command is going to want our heads for this," he noted quietly. "Probably. The tribunals will drag on for years. It's going to be exceptionally unpleasant." "Yeah. Was it worth it?" Hayes thought about the glowing crystal Velith Eos had pressed into Hale's hands. She thought about the 203 names burning with blue light into the living hull of Elindra. She thought about 6 billion heartbeats still thrumming in the dark. "Yeah," she said. Hale nodded. There was absolutely nothing else left to say. Meridian 9 grew larger in the viewport. A tiny station, a crew of 14, a long-range transmitter, and a signals analyst who had finally learned exactly what to do when the universe screamed. Somewhere out in the great, terrible void, someone else was eventually going to scream for help, and humanity would be listening. End of story.